What does it take for Michael Jordan, a man who has spent decades carefully guarding every single public word, to stop, look directly at two women's basketball players, and hand them the kind of praise he has never given anyone in the modern era of this sport? Not a vague nod. Not a polished PR statement carefully crafted by some marketing team. Real, deliberate, deeply considered words from the most competitive basketball mind who ever lived. And when those words finally came out, they did not just compliment Caitlyn Clark and Sophie Cunningham. They rearranged the entire conversation around women's basketball in a way nobody was fully prepared for. Here is what makes this different from every other celebrity shout-out you have heard before. Jordan does not do this. His silence on the women's game has been so consistent and so well known that the moment he broke it, every basketball analyst, every legend, and every serious fan stopped and paid attention. This was not praise from someone looking for headlines. This was validation from a man who has literally nothing left to prove to anyone. Before we go any further, drop CC Untouchable in the comments right now, because by the time this video is over, you're going to understand exactly why that phrase fits better than anything else out there. And trust me, the deeper we go into this story, the more your jaw is going to drop. Stay locked in. This one is different. Michael Jordan has built an almost mythological reputation around one specific habit: silence. Not the awkward silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the deliberate, calculated quiet of a man who understands that every word he speaks publicly carries enormous weight. He has watched countless players rise and fall. He has seen hype machines burn bright and collapse completely. He has lived through the brutal reality of being the most scrutinized athlete on the planet. So when Jordan decides to open his mouth and praise someone, anyone, the basketball world does not just listen politely. It freezes. That is exactly what happened when he turned his attention to Caitlyn Clark. What made this moment so strikingly different from the usual stream of celebrity endorsements was the precision of Jordan's language. He did not reach for the easy, surface-level observations that every casual analyst trots out whenever Clark's name comes up. He did not mention her record-breaking points total from her college career. He did not talk about her logo-range three-pointer or her viral highlights. He went somewhere far more interesting and far more revealing. He talked about her presence. That word sounds simple until you understand what Jordan means when he uses it. Presence, in Jordan's basketball vocabulary, is not about personality or charisma off the court. It is something far more specific and far more rare. It is the ability to walk onto a basketball court and immediately alter the behavior of every single player around you, opponents, teammates, and officials included, before you have even touched the ball. It is psychological dominance expressed through pure positioning, body language, and the unmistakable signal that you belong in any arena on the planet. Jordan identified that quality in Clark with a sharpness that made people uncomfortable because it forced everyone to confront something the sport had been dancing around for months. Clark does not look like she is adjusting to professional basketball. She looks like she has been running professional basketball her entire life. She steps onto the hardwood, and the defensive scheme of the opposing team visibly shifts. Rotations change. Assignments tighten. Help defense collapses toward her before she has even made a move, because the threat she poses without the ball is just as dangerous as what she does with it. Jordan saw all of that instantly, and the specific things he chose to highlight: her ability to read the floor before the play develops, her talent for creating space without the ball, her patience in waiting for the defense to overcommit before delivering a pass that splits the coverage perfectly. These are not rookie qualities. These are the instincts that separate good players from players who fundamentally change how the game is played around them. Her court vision alone places her in a category that most professional players never reach. She processes defensive information at a speed that makes her decision-making look almost effortless, which is the most deceptive thing about elite point guards. When a great decision looks easy, it is almost always the product of years of pattern recognition, operating at a level most players cannot access under pressure. Add to that her range, which genuinely forces defenses to cover ground that most teams have never had to defend before, and you start to understand why Jordan was not speaking in generalizations. He was describing a player who has already started bending the rules of what is possible in this sport. The validation this represents is genuinely difficult to overstate. Jordan is not a man who hands out praise to manage relationships or protect his public image. He is famously indifferent to how his opinions land socially. He says what he actually thinks, which is part of why his silence has always been so loud and why his words, when they come, hit so hard. He was not building Clark up as a marketing exercise. He was recognizing something he knows from the inside, the specific texture of a player who does not just play basketball but controls it. And the room felt that distinction immediately. Reports suggest that Clark and Sophie Cunningham, both present when Jordan's words landed, were not simply flattered in the way players usually are when a celebrity offers encouragement. The weight of his specific observations, the fact that he was describing not what they do statistically, but who they are competitively, produced a different kind of reaction. Something closer to the silence that follows a moment when someone articulates something you have always known about yourself, but never heard said out loud so clearly by someone whose judgment you deeply respect. Jordan made something unmistakably clear without ever using the word. Caitlyn Clark is not the future of this league. She is already its present, and she is already rewriting what that present looks like for everyone paying attention. But the most surprising part of Jordan's comments was not what he said about Clark. It was where he turned his attention next, and why that pivot revealed something even more important about what he actually sees when he watches this sport. When Michael Jordan shifted his attention from Caitlyn Clark to Sophie Cunningham, there was a moment where some people in the room probably expected a courtesy acknowledgement, a brief, polished mention of a solid role player before moving back to the headline name. That is not what happened. Jordan did not pivot away from the main story when he started talking about Cunningham. He deepened it, and in doing so, he revealed something about his own basketball philosophy that reframed the entire conversation. Cunningham has spent her career in a specific kind of professional shadow. She is enormously respected by players and coaches who understand what winning actually requires, and she is simultaneously overlooked by the media ecosystem that runs on highlights, scoring titles, and marketable personalities. She is not the player whose jersey sells out the arena store. She is the player whose presence in a lineup changes what the team on the other side of the floor is willing to attempt. That distinction is enormous in practice and almost invisible on a broadcast. Jordan did not just acknowledge Cunningham. He identified the specific qualities in her game that he recognized from his own career, the qualities he spent years developing, and that he considers the real currency of championship basketball. He talked about her competitive intensity, not as a personality trait, but as a tactical weapon. Her refusal to concede a single possession. Her willingness to take the physical punishment that comes with defending elite players, and doing it again the very next play without any visible hesitation. Her talent for shifting the emotional temperature of a game without ever needing the ball in her hands to do it. Anyone who has watched Jordan play at his peak recognizes exactly what he is describing, because he weaponized those same qualities at a level nobody has matched since. The defensive obsession, the personal grudge he carried into every possession on both ends of the court. The way he made opponents feel that competing against him was not just physically difficult but psychologically exhausting. Jordan saw that same engine running inside Cunningham, and he named it directly. What makes this so significant is the context. Sophie Cunningham joined the Indiana Fever in a 2025 trade that barely registered as major news outside of dedicated WNBA circles. She was not arriving as a superstar acquisition. She was arriving as a veteran presence with championship experience and a reputation built entirely on doing the things that do not generate viral moments. The basketball industry's standard response to a move like that is a polite paragraph and a quick move to the next story. Jordan's response was to single her out by name and describe her contribution with the kind of detailed, specific language he reserves for players he genuinely respects. That reframing matters enormously for Cunningham personally, but it matters even more for what it says about the team dynamic Jordan was observing. He was not just complimenting two individual players in isolation. He was describing a partnership, two players whose very different strengths create something that neither could produce independently. Clark's creative brilliance and Cunningham's protective ferocity are not just complementary qualities on a roster. They are, according to Jordan's reading, the exact combination that turns a talented team into a genuinely threatening one. Cunningham's path to this moment was built entirely without the advantages Clark arrived with. She spent years overseas during the WNBA offseason, playing through brutal schedules in leagues that barely registered on American sports radar, collecting experience and scar tissue in roughly equal measure. She survived the era when women's professional basketball operated on budgets and platforms that made it genuinely difficult to build a sustainable career without a second income source. She knows what it costs to stay in this league through seasons when the audience is small, the pay is modest, and the recognition is almost non-existent. That history gives her credibility in the locker room that no amount of highlight reel moments can manufacture. When Cunningham speaks about sacrifice, accountability, and the price of competing at this level, her teammates are hearing it from someone who actually paid that price in full. And when she stands next to Clark, whose arrival triggered a commercial revolution the league had been waiting decades for, she represents the bridge between everything this sport endured to survive and everything it is suddenly becoming. Jordan grasped that bridge dynamic and called it out clearly. His praise of Cunningham was not a consolation acknowledgement of a secondary player. It was a recognition that what Cunningham brings to the situation is, in its own way, as rare and as critical as what Clark brings. Talent at Clark's level emerges occasionally. The character and competitive fire that Cunningham carries into every game and every practice, the kind that does not require an audience to stay burning, that is something far harder to find and far harder to build. The room felt it, and then the rest of the basketball world started weighing in, one legend at a time. Jordan opening the door was one thing. What happened after that door swung open was something the sports media landscape genuinely did not see coming. Because once the most competitive basketball mind in history put his credibility behind Caitlyn Clark and Sophie Cunningham, other legends started making their own calculations, and several of them arrived at conclusions that surprised even their closest observers. Larry Bird was among the first to respond in a way that carried real weight. And the way he responded said as much about his own basketball values as it did about Clark specifically. Bird's reputation in basketball circles rests on a very particular foundation. He is not the legend who praises broadly or distributes compliments as a social currency. His acknowledgement has always functioned more like a quality control stamp, earned only when the basketball he is watching meets an exceptionally specific standard. He spent decades building that reputation, and the people who know him well understand that an empty compliment from Larry Bird is essentially impossible, because he simply does not make them. So when reports surfaced that Bird had watched significantly more Iowa women's basketball games during the 2023-24 season than he had originally intended, and that he had found himself making direct comparisons between Clark's playing style and his own college days at Indiana State, the basketball world paid attention in a very specific way. This was not a celebrity stopping to acknowledge a viral moment. This was a basketball purist confessing that he had been pulled back to the game by something he genuinely recognized: precision, stamina, floor vision, and the icy competitive composure that Bird built his entire legend on. The comparison Bird drew was not casual. Indiana State represents a very particular chapter in his basketball biography, the period when he was developing the specific qualities that would eventually make him one of the most complete players the sport has ever seen. His court awareness during those years was almost supernatural. His ability to read a defense before it had finished setting up, to anticipate rotations that had not happened yet, and to deliver passes to spots where his teammates would be in 2 seconds rather than where they were standing right now. Those qualities defined him then and define his legacy now. Seeing those same instincts in Clark was not nostalgia for Bird. It was recognition, and there is a meaningful difference between those two things. Nostalgia is emotional and imprecise. Recognition is analytical and specific. Bird was not getting sentimental about a young player who reminded him of himself. He was identifying a particular set of basketball skills and confirming that they existed at a level worthy of serious comparison. Then came Shaquille O'Neal, and his journey toward publicly acknowledging Clark was considerably more complicated and considerably more revealing than Bird's. Shaq had spent the early part of Clark's WNBA tenure in a position that most people understood as loyal opposition. His long-standing support for Angel Reese, which was public, vocal, and entirely genuine, created a natural perception that he was on the other side of the most discussed rivalry in women's basketball. He had been outspoken in his backing of Reese's physical, aggressive, dominant style, and nobody who watched him regularly expected that position to shift. What happened instead was something that the sports media ecosystem struggles to handle gracefully, because it requires acknowledging nuance in a space that usually prefers clean sides. During a live broadcast, Shaq stopped mid-conversation and said something that landed differently than his usual commentary. He was not walking back his support for Reese. He was adding something to his basketball worldview that he had apparently been resisting for a while before finally allowing it in. He admitted he had originally questioned whether Clark's massive television presence was producing genuine basketball excellence or simply generating the kind of hype that cameras create around attractive personalities regardless of substance. That is a fair and honest question, and it is the kind of question that Shaq, with his experience at the absolute peak of the sport, is uniquely qualified to ask. What he then described was the moment that question resolved itself for him, when he locked in on her gameplay with the analytical attention of a former champion rather than the casual eye of a television personality, and found that the substance was absolutely there. Her court vision, the speed of her decision-making under defensive pressure, the way she reads the intentions of the defense before the play fully develops and exploits the gap that is about to appear rather than the one that currently exists. Her leadership composure in moments when younger players typically tighten up and become predictable. Shaq described all of this not with the careful language of a media professional managing relationships, but with the blunt enthusiasm of someone who loves great basketball and had just been reminded why. That distinction, speaking as a fan of the game rather than as a public figure managing affiliations, gave his words a texture that separated them from standard celebrity praise. Shaq has nothing to prove and nothing to gain from adjusting his public position on anything. He said what he saw, and what he saw convinced him. Between Jordan's foundational validation, Bird's deeply specific recognition, and Shaq's converted admiration, something had started to crystallize around Clark and Cunningham that went beyond the usual celebrity endorsement cycle. These were not people manufacturing enthusiasm for a product. These were basketball lifers recognizing something real, each from their own angle, each with their own particular framework for understanding what excellence in this sport actually looks like. And that convergence of legendary voices was pointing directly at something much larger than two players having a good season. Numbers tell part of the story, but they do not tell the most important part. What Caitlyn Clark's arrival in the WNBA triggered was not just a statistical improvement in league performance metrics. It was a fundamental reorganization of how American sports culture relates to women's professional basketball, a reorganization that happened faster and with more force than anyone inside or outside the league had modeled for. The television ratings were the most visible signal. Games featuring Clark were drawing audiences that made network executives do double takes and then immediately start renegotiating how they were scheduling and promoting the product. Broadcast numbers that would have represented extraordinary success for the WNBA in its previous era became the baseline expectation for Indiana Fever games by the middle of Clark's first season. The ceiling had moved, and it had moved dramatically. Arenas tell the same story from a different angle. Cities that had previously hosted WNBA games in venues with substantial empty sections were suddenly managing sellout crowds and waitlists. Several markets moved games to larger facilities mid-season to accommodate demand that the original scheduling had not anticipated. This is not a small operational adjustment. Moving a professional sports franchise's games to a different arena requires enormous logistical effort and carries financial risk. Teams were making that call because the alternative, leaving thousands of people without tickets for games they were desperate to attend, represented a missed opportunity they could not justify. Merchandise sales created their own headline. Clark's jerseys were selling out within hours of restocking, competing in volume with established stars from leagues that dwarf the WNBA in historical commercial footprint. The supply chain for officially licensed Clark merchandise was genuinely struggling to keep pace with demand, which is a problem that women's professional basketball had simply never had to solve before. But the most consequential shift was not measurable in any of those conventional metrics. It was the change in who was paying attention. Clark's arrival dragged the WNBA into mainstream sports conversations in a way that decades of incremental progress had not achieved. Casual sports fans who had never watched a full women's basketball game were tuning in not as an act of cultural obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to see what she was going to do next. Corporate sponsors who had historically viewed WNBA partnerships as modest community investments were suddenly treating them as premium placements. Media outlets that had covered the league as a secondary beat were assigning front-page resources. Tyrese Halliburton's perspective on this moment is worth examining carefully. because he occupies an unusual vantage point. As the face of the Indiana Pacers and one of the most thoughtful young leaders in professional basketball, he had a front-row seat to what Clark's presence was doing to the city of Indianapolis. He was not talking about her the way celebrities talk about athletes they want to be associated with. He was talking about her the way one competitor recognizes another, with the specific respect of someone who understands what it costs to carry a franchise and a city's expectations simultaneously. He saw the Fever's transformation not as a media narrative, but as a genuine organizational challenge that Clark was navigating in real time. Building a winning culture while simultaneously serving as the public face of a commercial revolution, while managing the intense scrutiny that follows every game and every decision, while doing all of this as a rookie in a new professional environment. Halliburton understood that weight from his own experience and spoke about Clark's ability to carry it with genuine admiration. The analyst Jason Whitlock introduced a genuinely provocative idea into this conversation when he argued that Clark's presence was beginning to influence how other players thought about the league as a destination. His suggestion that established players might factor in the opportunity to play alongside Clark when making professional decisions sparked real debate, partly because it was difficult to verify, and partly because it touched something real. In professional sports, players make decisions based on many factors beyond salary and market size. Team culture, competitive opportunity, and the kind of environment a franchise creates all matter. Clark's presence was changing what Indiana represented on all of those dimensions. And standing right beside that transformation, often without enough credit, was Sophie Cunningham, a player who understood exactly how different this moment was because she had survived the era that preceded it. There are moments in an athlete's career that function as defining tests, not because of what they demand physically, but because of what they reveal about character under conditions that nobody prepares you for. For Caitlyn Clark, that moment arrived in the form of a roster announcement that left her name completely off a list that most of the basketball world had assumed she would headline. When the United States Olympic team for the 2024 Paris Games was finalized without Clark's inclusion, the reaction was not limited to disappointed fans posting online. It reached into professional sports media, mainstream news coverage, and conversations among former players and coaches who understood the selection process intimately. The consensus across those different audiences was largely the same. This was wrong, and the people who made this decision needed to answer for it. The argument against her inclusion was never particularly strong when examined honestly. Selection criteria that emphasized established veteran experience had legitimate logic in the abstract, but became difficult to defend in practice when applied to a player who had, in the course of a single college season, produced the most attention-generating performance in women's basketball history. The WNBA's entire commercial trajectory was shifting because of what Clark was doing on a basketball court. The idea that she was not ready for the Olympic stage required a very specific and very selective reading of the available evidence. Fan fury was immediate, vocal, and sustained in a way that differed from typical sports controversy. People were not just angry about a roster decision. They were angry about what the decision represented, the sense that an institution that had just benefited enormously from Clark's impact was failing to fully recognize what she had brought to the table. The optics were genuinely difficult for the people who made the call, and they remained difficult for months afterward, as Clark's performance in the WNBA continued to make the argument for her elite status with every game she played. Clark's response to all of this is the part of the story that matters most and gets the least attention. She did not engage the controversy publicly in any way that could be characterized as self-serving. She did not give interviews where she carefully packaged her disappointment into media-friendly sound bites. She did not post. She did not comment. She did not allow herself to be drawn into a public performance of grievance that would have generated significant media coverage and zero actual benefit. She went quiet in the specific and deliberate way that separates athletes who are genuinely focused on their craft from athletes who are focused on their narrative. What she did instead was work. The absence of Olympic travel and the reduction in media demands that would have accompanied that entire experience gave her something genuinely valuable: time. Time to train with more focus than a packed summer schedule would have allowed. Time to study film on opponents she would face in the WNBA. time to work on the specific elements of her professional game that needed development without the constant interruption of cameras and questions. She converted a professional disappointment into a competitive advantage, with a discipline that most athletes several years her senior would struggle to replicate. Dwight Howard, watching this play out from outside, spoke about it with a directness that cut through the noise. He was not surprised that Clark would emerge from the experience stronger. He recognized the psychological pattern, the way truly competitive people process public rejection, not as damage but as data, filing the experience away as motivation that will eventually express itself as performance. He was confident she would not fracture under the pressure. He was right. Jeff Teague's reaction came from a different angle and carried a different edge. His argument that the WNBA had made a fundamental strategic error, not just in the Olympic selection specifically, but in the broader pattern of not fully capitalizing on the momentum Clark had generated, reflected genuine frustration from someone who understood the business of professional basketball. The league had been handed a once-in-a-generation commercial opportunity, and the way it had handled several key moments in Clark's early career suggested an institution that was struggling to move at the speed the moment demanded. Rick Barry brought the historical perspective that grounded the conversation in something beyond current events. Having played through an era of professional basketball that operated by different rules, physical rules, competitive rules, and the unwritten rules around how new talent was welcomed into established professional environments, he identified something in Clark's treatment that he recognized from his own experience: the roughness of her welcome. The hard fouls that carried something extra beyond normal professional physicality. The cold reception from some peers who should have been celebrating what her presence was doing for the entire league. Barry's observation that the treatment felt personal rather than purely competitive was significant because it named something people had been discussing in indirect language. And it came from a man whose credibility on the subject of old-school professional basketball is essentially unimpeachable. Clark stayed quiet through all of it. She took the hits. She absorbed the cold shoulders. She answered every dismissal with her performance rather than her words. And in doing so, she built something that no amount of publicity can manufacture: the credibility that comes from being tested in full view of everyone and refusing to break. While she was doing that, Cunningham was preparing to become something the Fever locker room desperately needed. There is a specific kind of leadership that does not photograph well, does not generate highlight reels, and does not show up cleanly in any statistical category that casual fans track. It is the leadership that operates in locker rooms after bad losses, in practice sessions when the energy is flat, in the moments between possessions when a team's culture either holds together or quietly begins to fracture. Sophie Cunningham has been practicing that kind of leadership her entire professional career, mostly without an audience. What the 2025 season did was finally give that leadership a stage large enough for the rest of the basketball world to see what it actually looks like. After a difficult loss in June 2025 that exposed the Fever's inconsistency in a way that could not be explained away by matchup problems or bad shooting nights, Cunningham did not wait for a team meeting to be scheduled. She did not soften her assessment to protect feelings or manage relationships. She identified the specific problem, a lack of defensive consistency and competitive focus that had been building over several games. And she named it directly, publicly, and without the careful language of someone worried about how the comment would land in the media. This is not a small thing. Professional athletes operate in an environment where candid public criticism of team performance carries real social and professional risk. Teammates remember, coaches notice, front offices track the narrative. The safe play is always to be vague, to talk about the process, to express confidence in the group without identifying the specific failures that made the loss possible. Cunningham chose the other path because she believed the team needed to hear the truth more than it needed to feel comfortable. And then she backed every word with action, which is the only thing that gives that kind of candor any lasting credibility. When Clark missed a preseason game due to injury concerns, the pressure shifted in a way that exposed the depth of the roster in real time. Teams built around a singular star talent are always vulnerable in those moments. The plays that existed to create space for the primary option suddenly have nowhere to go, and the other players are forced to generate offense from a structure that was not designed around their strengths. Cunningham did not wait for the game to find its rhythm organically. She took the ball, took the pressure, and in the moments that mattered most, with the game tied and overtime looming, stepped to the free throw line and sank both shots with the composed indifference of someone who has been in far higher pressure situations than this, and came out the other side. The win mattered, the manner of it mattered more. Cunningham had demonstrated that the Fever's competitive identity did not disappear when its most famous player was unavailable. That is exactly the kind of statement that changes how a locker room understands itself. Her first double-double of the season, 16 points and 10 rebounds against Atlanta, came with a self-deprecating acknowledgement that was completely characteristic. She smiled and said it had taken long enough, and the laugh that accompanied it was the laugh of someone who does not need external validation to understand their own value, but who enjoys the moment when the numbers finally reflect what the film has been showing for weeks. Her humor was never the armor of someone hiding insecurity. It was the confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are and does not require the stat sheet to confirm it. The moment that may define Cunningham's 2025 season in the long memory of this sport, however, was not a basket or a rebound. It was a sprint. During a physically aggressive game, where Clark absorbed a brutal foul that carried something beyond the normal roughness of professional competition, Cunningham covered the distance between her position and Clark's in the kind of time that only pure competitive instinct produces. She was not calculating the optics. She was not thinking about what the cameras were capturing. She put her body between her teammate and the situation, and she made it absolutely clear to everyone on that floor that getting to Clark required going through her first. What she was communicating in that moment went far beyond team loyalty. She was establishing a standard for what this team's culture would and would not tolerate. She was sending a message to opponents that the physical harassment of Clark came with a cost. And she was telling her teammates something that no speech in a locker room can fully convey, that she was not in this alone, that the person next to her had chosen to be exactly there and was not going anywhere. Veterans like Jordan and Bird understand the weight of that kind of moment because they have been on both sides of it. They have had teammates who made that choice and teammates who calculated the risk and stayed back. They know which kind of player changes a team's DNA and which kind leaves it fundamentally the same as it was before they arrived. Cunningham was not just protecting Clark in that moment. She was building something, and that something was starting to matter to the entire league in ways that nobody had fully anticipated yet. Michael Jordan has a specific way of talking about disruption that comes from having been the most disruptive force in basketball history. He does not romanticize it. He does not describe the experience of fundamentally reshaping a sport as purely triumphant. He talks about the cost, the specific, uncomfortable, sometimes ugly cost of arriving somewhere and rearranging the power structure by simply being what you are. His words about Clark carried that understanding. The praise was real. But underneath, it was something that sounded more like a quiet warning from someone who has lived this particular story and knows how it tends to go. When Jordan spoke about Clark's competitive presence and the disruption her rise was creating, he was drawing on an experience he knows from the inside. His arrival in the NBA did not produce universal celebration among the players already there. It produced resentment, strategic targeting, and the specific kind of hostility that emerges when people who have built careers and identities within a system suddenly feel that system reorganizing itself around someone who has not yet paid what they consider the appropriate dues. The difference was not whether Clark deserved the attention. The question that mattered to the people already in the league was whether she had earned the right to reorganize their world on her timeline. Clark had not come up through the system the way the veterans who were watching her had. She had not spent years playing for modest pay in front of modest crowds, slowly accumulating the professional credibility that the league's established culture considered the prerequisite for the kind of commercial and cultural status she arrived with. She had skipped that entire phase entirely. One extraordinary college career had placed her at the center of a commercial revolution that players who had given decades to the sport had never experienced. That imbalance was real, and the resentment it generated was also real. Shady comments from Cheryl Swoops arrived with the edge of someone who had legitimate grievances about how the league had operated for decades, but who was applying those grievances in a direction that made the wrong player the target. Swoops' criticism of Clark, suggesting that the attention she received was disproportionate to what she had accomplished at the professional level, would have had more force if it had been directed at the system that produced the imbalance rather than at the player who was simply being what she was. Instead, it landed as the kind of remark that tells you more about the frustration behind it than about the player it is describing. Diana Taurasi's approach was different in tone, but equally revealing in what it exposed about the league's complicated internal relationship with Clark's presence. Taurasi is one of the most accomplished players in women's basketball history, and her warnings to Clark, framed as veteran wisdom, but carrying a current of something less generous, reflected the complex position of a legend watching the narrative around her sport reorganize itself around someone new. It was not simple jealousy. Taurasi had built something real over a long career, and the speed with which the commercial conversation had shifted to center on a rookie raised legitimate questions about what the sports media machine values and how it decides where to direct its attention. What made both of those reactions complicated was the uncomfortable truth that sat underneath them. The resentment Clark was experiencing was not primarily her problem to solve. It was a symptom of decades of inequity within the league, underpaid players, underinvested infrastructure, and a commercial ecosystem that had never delivered what the talent in the league deserved. Clark's arrival had not created that inequity, but her presence had made it dramatically more visible, which was uncomfortable for everyone who had adapted to it. Magic Johnson's comparison of Clark's debut to the arrival of himself and Larry Bird in the NBA was not intended as hyperbole for the sake of a headline. He was drawing a structural parallel that he understood from direct experience. The Magic Bird era did not just produce great basketball. It reorganized the NBA's entire commercial identity, creating the financial foundation that allowed the league to become what it is today. Johnson was suggesting that Clark's arrival had the potential to do something equivalent for women's basketball, to function as the catalyst that finally aligned the league's commercial trajectory with the actual quality of the product on the floor. Stephen Curry's contribution to this conversation was more focused and more specifically basketball-oriented, but it carried its own weight. Curry has redefined what range shooting means in professional basketball with a degree of completeness that makes him the singular reference point for anyone discussing deep shooting in the modern game. When he looked at Clark's game and chose to praise not just her range but the total package, the court awareness, the decision speed, the leadership composure, he was making a specific and deliberate point about what she actually is as a player versus how the media tends to summarize her. She is not a shooting trick. She is a complete basketball player who happens to also have extraordinary range. The persistent fan speculation about a shootout between Curry and Clark, which Clark consistently deflects with good humor whenever it comes up, reflects something real about how the basketball culture has processed her arrival. She has been placed in conversations that include the most celebrated players in the sport regardless of gender, and she occupies that space comfortably, which is itself a kind of statement about where the game is heading. Beneath all of the legendary validation, the commercial numbers, and the cultural conversation, the tension that Jordan identified was not going away. It was evolving. The resentment that greeted Clark's arrival was beginning to interact with something larger, the question of who would ultimately benefit from the commercial revolution she had triggered, and whether the players who had given decades to building this league would finally receive the compensation and conditions their talent had always deserved. Clark had the spotlight. Cunningham had the history. Together, they represented something the league had never had before, a partnership between a player with enormous commercial leverage and a veteran who knew exactly where that leverage needed to be applied. The question was not whether the change was coming. The question was whether the institutions controlling the sport were prepared to accept the direction it was heading. And that question had no comfortable answer for anyone invested in keeping things exactly as they were. Here is what this whole story actually comes down to. Michael Jordan does not speak without reason. Larry Bird does not watch more games than he plans to without recognizing something real. Shaquille O'Neal does not reverse a public position without seeing something that genuinely changed his mind. And Sophie Cunningham does not sprint across a basketball court to protect a teammate unless she believes that teammate represents something worth protecting. Caitlyn Clark and Sophie Cunningham are not just two players having a good season inside a league that is finally getting attention. They are the visible edge of a transformation that has been building for decades and is now moving faster than anyone, inside the league or outside it, was fully prepared to handle. The commercial revolution is real. The resentment is real. The opportunity is real. And the people trying to control the direction of all three, are about to find out that the players at the center of this moment have very specific ideas about where it goes next. The question worth sitting with after this video ends is simple. When a sport finally gets the moment it has always needed, who actually gets to decide what happens with it? Drop your answer in the comments. And make sure you are subscribed to Clark's Spotlight, because this story is nowhere near finished.